So here are some of the past paper 12 markers that we've had for Theme D. You might want to pause the video here and just have a go at planning some of these and noting the themes within the questions. What we haven't had in a Theme D 12 marker yet are questions about terrorism, violence generally, violent protest, or reconciliation and forgiveness. So that might be something that you maybe give some extra thought to in preparation for this exam. So in terms of last minute tips and things to remember, I think these important religious teachings and concepts should be right there in your memory in readiness for the exam. You can relate them to several different topics. So Jesus taught, for example, blessed are the peacemakers. You can use that if there's a question about war, about weapons. You can use it if there's a question about pacifism, about protest, about terrorism. So you can really bring it into most things. Jesus also taught love your enemies, which applies too. And then from another perspective, we have evidence from the Old Testament part of the Bible that's much more positive, it seems, around the use of violence potentially and the necessity of war. So we have the Lord as a warrior, and there is a time for war and a time for peace. Obviously, our second religion aside from Christianity is Islam, and we also have Quran teachings such as fight in the cause of God those who fight you but do not transgress limits, which are useful if you're talking about holy war, you're talking about fighting in self-defense, and also the use of proportional response. So you can't use, for example, a weapon of mass destruction if that's not what has been used against you. Two other important concepts to remember aside from these religious teachings are the just war theory and lesser jihad. So the just war theory is a list of criteria that was developed in the Catholic Church that gives reasons when a war could be considered just or right. This includes criteria such as if you're acting in self-defense or to protect innocent people. Lesser jihad is a list of criteria from Islamic teaching in the Quran that gives reasons also when a war could be considered acceptable, in this case acceptable to God, hence holy war, such as if you are defending God or Islam, or again acting to protect innocent people in self-defense. Also remember that Quakers practice and believe very strongly in pacifism, so Quaker teachings are always against war and violence of any kind, whether that's protest or in the case of war, obviously. So here we have a couple of practice questions that I've tried to model for you how to answer, just to remind you about the structure. So we've got 2 4 markers on topics that are a bit more niche, not just the kind of classic war versus peace. So 2 similar religious beliefs about terrorism. We've got a Christian belief about terrorism is that it is always wrong. This is because the aim of terrorism is to kill people, and in the Bible it states, you shall not kill. So we've got a point and then development in the second sentence. And then a second religious belief that's similar is a similar view about terrorism. It's found in Islam, which also shows that terrorism is wrong. This is because the rules of lesser jihad make it very clear that it is only acceptable to use violence in self-defense, and this does not apply to terrorist acts. So again, we've got a point there and a development. Notice that I've used the word similar that's in the question in my second section, and also notice that I've referred to the specific religion that I'm talking about. These questions want you to give religious beliefs, so you need to make it clear which religion you're referring to. Second question, explain 2 religious beliefs about protest. So we have one Christian belief about protest is that Christians have a duty to protest against evil and injustice. This is because doing this puts Jesus' teaching to love your neighbour into practice. And then a second Christian belief about protest is that all protests must be peaceful and lawful. This is because the Bible states that Christians need to obey the laws of the land. So again, note point development. So I just wanted to also kind of break down for you how you could tackle a 12 marker on a topic that hasn't come up yet before, which is the use of violence. And so the question I've come up with is the use of violence is never right. Again, remember, we're going to be using our bullet points here as a guide for what needs to be included in our answer. As you're writing your 12 marker, just either mentally check them off or put a line through them as you cover each bullet point so you know that you're giving yourself a chance to be marked out of 12. So in terms of agree points, this is what I came up with. So the use of violence is never right. Well, pacifists such as Quakers would agree with this. They believe that violence can never be right, whether we're talking about war violence or violence being used during protest or terrorism, for example. Obviously, evidence from the Bible to support the pacifist stance comes from Jesus' teaching. So he famously said, of course, blessed are the peacemakers, and also love your enemies. And remember that Quakers feel so strongly about this issue that using violence is never right, that during World War One and World War Two, they were actually conscientious objectors and they would not fight. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, also agreed with this statement. So he put Jesus' teaching to turn the other cheek into practice by refusing to retaliate and use violence during the civil rights movement, even when he was faced with violence. So his house was bombed and he was assaulted, but he refused to use violence because he believed in Jesus' teachings about non-retaliation, and he would agree that the use of violence is never right. To disagree with this statement, well, from a non-religious perspective, of course, the Lord does allow the use of violence in self-defense, which means that sometimes using violence could be considered right and legal and lawful. Using violence in protest could also be a way to get attention for your protest if no one is listening, although that wouldn't, of course, be legal. In the Old Testament part of the Bible, we know that people are sometimes commanded by God to go to war, which suggests that using violence could sometimes be right, which disagrees with the statement in the question. The prophet Joel tells people that God wants them to go and fight. So it says, prepare for war, rouse the warriors, let all the fighting men draw near and attack. And it also states in the Old Testament of the Bible too that the Lord is a warrior, implying that God would also not always be against war and the use of violence. Furthermore, both the Christian just war theory and the Islamic rules for lesser jihad suggest that using violence in war could be acceptable and even the right thing to do if you're defending yourself or defending a just cause. So that also could be seen as evidence to state that the use of violence is never right is a statement that should be disagreed with.